Hi there, and welcome back to the HRE 2.0 audio series. Today we're going to talk about Unit 4. And again, as a quick reminder, as I move from topic to topic, you don't have to listen to this all in one shot. You can listen to it in sections and then work on the research questions as you go, or again, you can kind of work with this as you please when you go through the material. So, Unit 4 deals with this idea of family life. Excuse me, sorry. The first topic is that of commitment. So when we look at this idea of commitment, we're going to look at a little bit, we're going to kind of recap and kind of give you a little bit more information about the Trinity. You've heard me talk about it in other units. So we talk about the Trinity as one, because this concept can be kind of confusing for non-Catholics. So the Trinity is one. We do not confess three gods, but one God in three persons, the consubstantial Trinity. The divine persons do not share the one divinity among themselves, but each of them is God, whole and entire. So in other words, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. So God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are each God. They are God. Okay? The divine persons are really distinct from one another. In other words, they are unique individuals. The divine persons are relative to one another. It's their distinction. The real distinction is the fact that they have unique relationships to one another. The Father is related to the Son to the Father, and the Holy Spirit to both. While they are called three persons, in view of their relations, we believe in one nature or substance. In other words, this can get confusing, and it's not something that is going to be easy to understand. But that's three persons in one being. That's really what you got to try to wrap your head around. That's where this is kind of headed, and understanding that. Helps us recognize how we are created in God's image. Okay, the fact that God has three unique persons that make up God. We, as human beings, hear people talk about body, mind, and soul. Those are three unique combinations that make each and every one of us. All right. So there's that kind of, hopefully, a little bit of a metaphor to kind of connect the two, and the fact that we're created in God's image. Everyone is created in God's image. Okay. It's important to recognize that that understanding also rests in our understanding of the Trinity. Okay. And how that Trinity individuals act throughout different points in time. If you look at God, God's the architect, the Father, but God has played the longest role in history. I mean, that's our first contact through Abraham historically was God. Our next historical contact is Jesus in the person, God in person, and then we have the Holy Spirit that brings us into the present and the future. The being that God, that the God that acts with the church now, acts with Christians and people of faith. Here's some characteristics of the Trinity. God gives love and receives love. God is peaceful. God is giving. God is kind. God is gracious. In better understanding that commitment, it's also recognizing that commitment to not only your family, but the family that is the church, or the family that is the Catholic religion. These traits we try to emulate ourselves, and it can be difficult. Hence why we go back to the earlier unit where we talked about the sacraments of healing, why we sin because we fall away from these things. We don't do this at certain times for whatever reason. We can get overly emotional, overly angry, overly whatever, and we sin to one degree or another, and that sin creates a need for healing, and that helps reinforce our commitment to God through the sacrament of confession, sacraments of healing. All right. Um, really, the other things you kind of need to be aware of or keep in mind um, is how do we translate that idea of being in God's image, and how does that translate into the world we live in and the relationships that we have, and how do we work at that? And really, those are going to be personal answers in one sense. In the kind of the general grand scheme of things, it goes back to what we talked about in an earlier unit where we talked about our humanity and understanding that all humans are sacred. Because all humans are sacred, there needs to be a commitment from us to respond to that sacredness and treat that sacredness with dignity and respect, which we see borne out in the relationships within the Trinity itself. Which kind of brings us to topic number 2, which again I just mentioned. We talk about relationships. Um, Now we're looking at the idea of healthy or unhealthy relationships. Um, this is all going to revolve around dealing with conflict. So conflict is natural and an inevitable part of all relationships. Fundamentally, folks, you need to be concerned when anybody tells you that they've been married or they're dating somebody and they never fight. Um, that's code for they don't argue or fight like the way we may have witnessed another couple fight, but there's always going to be some kind of friction, and some couples deal with it better than others. Some couples deal with it in a very weird way, or um, you know, really the best way to deal with conflicts is to be trying to be understanding, asking questions, not blaming. Conflicts help us to better understand our own faults and challenges and help us become more understanding and less judgmental of others. Um, really, relationships come down to the fact that it's do unto others. So, if you try to treat any kind of conflict, recognizing that you wouldn't want to be treated in a certain way in an argument, you shouldn't be treating somebody else that way. Um, the next one is go to the source and get the facts straight. Gossip, unfortunately, has become a rather interesting tool today because of social media and the world people live in. People post things that I would consider quote unquote private, or things that you may not want the general public to consume, and then are shocked and awed when the general public weighs in either positively or negatively about this. Um, if that's the case, don't do it. Like, just as an aside, you know, you look at famous actors, actresses, famous people. They'll take like a week, a month long sabbatical from social media because they can't handle, the quote unquote negativity. It's never that they can't handle the positivity, they can't handle the negativity, or they find it's too negative and it's affecting them. Well, that's because a good chunk of your life is for public consumption. And if you're okay with making that available for public consumption, you should be okay with whatever comes from the public consuming it, good or bad. Um, at that point, you can't approach the source. The source is anonymous at times, or it's digital. It's not a source you can get your or go right to and go, haha. It's not a source you can um, easily confront. So what are you left with? Well, you're left with internalizing yourself, and that creates an unhealthy relationship. Um, Give people the benefit of the doubt. That's easier said than done. Always assume the best in somebody else. That's probably the hardest thing I find because it's, certain things are going to happen where you're going to be left looking at it and going, I don't know what the positive thing was there, if there was one. Take a problem-solving approach. Um, think of a few different solutions. Pick one you think will work best, and agree to give it a try. Um, I've always lived by the motto: "I'll try means I'll fail." Um, if you're going to if you're going to solve a conflict, you need to decide on a course of action and do it, not try it and then go back and go, well, that didn't work. So because that's where you end up with more arguments because, well, we did this, it didn't work. Um, all of those things are very valid and work, but it takes a tremendous amount of effort. And if the person you're dealing with in a conflict won't take those approaches, um, it becomes even harder. There's the one thing that this system doesn't take into account is the fact that you may be dealing with an individual who doesn't do that, won't do this. All right. Um, then what do you do? You really need to think about the types of relationships that you have in your life: God, friends, parents, siblings, extended family, uh, possibly the church, parish, priest, coach, etc. Um, you got to look at your role in those relationships, the effort that it takes for relationships to work effectively. Um, and there's something that I think people tend to overlook. People look at relationships and I'll speak from my own experience when I talk about marriage, because that's kind of a relationship that tends to be on display a fair bit for people. Not every nook and cranny or every skeleton in the closet, but you have to work at relationships to keep them going. When relationships break down or become unhealthy, it's because one or both parties um, refuse to work at it. Um, and when that happens, this is where you see a lot of things spiral. Anyways, you look at 7 signs of a healthy friendship. It's mutual respect, trust. I find that mutual respect is first and trust is second. I would flip those personally. I would think trust is number one. 3 is honesty. There's a tightrope you're going to walk in any kind of relationship with people because you'll hear people talk about, well, I want you to be brutally honest with me. How is that? I have trouble understanding how brutal honesty is different from honesty. Oh, brutal honesty is you're going to tell people exactly what you're thinking because it may hurt their feelings. Whereas the de facto situation nowadays is we live in a politically correct world where you have to mitigate what you say so you're not upsetting someone, which to me creates more problems than it's worth. Um, when you talk about you know things that are being said aren't meant to harm or hurt you. When you talk about being honesty, it's from a place of care and concern, but that gets easily mixed up. The next one is support, um, fairness and equity. Notice it's not equality. Fairness and equity. Equity is recognizing that everybody's got their own unique kind of situation, and because that situation is unique, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all kind of response to given situations. Despite people may tell you, or situations may say, well, you should do this. Well, yes, you should do this, but then that's got to be mitigated by the situation of that individual. 6 is separate identities, and the last one, if you're keeping count, is good communication. Um, what's interesting about that, when you look at relationships, if they've been long-term relationships, um, friendships, dating somebody, that communication evolves and changes, and sometimes it works um, without talking, which people will go, that's never a good thing. Um, you know, it's the idea about being important. It's open to be, or important to be open to talking and especially listening. Um, I found that, um, you know, surprisingly, more people like to talk than they do listen. There's the interesting thing in relationships, and that's something you can work at. But those are things I'm not going to break into those ideas. Those should be fairly obvious what they are based on those elements. Uh, you can see more in the topic notes if you want to delve into that a little bit more. Uh, but those are the things you want to keep in mind when you're talking about a relationship, and those elements are demonstrated within the Trinity. Okay, those are obvious when you look at examples of the Trinity throughout history. They're all there. Those seven elements are there. Which brings us to topic number three, which is, kind of springboards off of that whole relationships, which is effective communication. Um, Personally, I can tell you that I'm probably not the best communicator in my marriage. My wife is much better at that, and I will personally say, and this is not to sound sexist, women are probably much better communicators than than men tend to be. Um, it's it can be tough because sometimes you're not entirely sure of why you're upset or why you're not upset. Um, it can be tough too to talk about things that you may take for granted, you may think is fine, but somebody else wants to talk about, not to dredge things up or make you feel uncomfortable because they, you know, want to make sure things are working. Um, you look at you look at any kind of example situation, whether we're talking examples of relationships in the Bible versus examples of relationships on TV. I don't know where else you want to go, books, etc. Um, Conflict is what drives people. People are interested in conflict and how people resolve it. Um, and yet, surprisingly, the way things are resolved in a lot of fictional settings is not how things resolve themselves in the real world. So you get this very kind of stilted picture from, you know, TV on one hand. Oh, excuse me, sorry about that. And then you look at how people deal with relationships on social media, and there's another stilted picture as to how communication does or does not work. Uh, and I think there's where you start to see relationships become problematic, is when we lose sight of how to effectively communicate. You can effectively communicate through social media, uh, but it seems like people are, and I say people, it's not anyone in particular or an overly broad generalization, but people tend to be, quite willing to attack things, so to speak, with regards to what somebody said or not said because it doesn't take into account this, or this. Um, and no offense, just as an interesting aside, an interesting example, find an article, find something you're interested in online, and then look at people's responses to that article or whatever. And then follow that line of thinking, go down. Sure, not because I think you should, you want to be nosy or whatever, but just see how the meandering twists and turns the discussion or responses take, because it becomes something very different after 6 or 7 responses and people responding to responses than what was initially said or what the initial article or concept was about. and people responding to it. And that's I've caught myself doing it. I find it interesting because you're kind of like, where did this come from? And again, I get it. Sometimes social media is a great place to vent as well, but it's not. It doesn't do anything to strengthen our human relationships with one another. Okay. In fact, it becomes detrimental to relationships. And most of you have probably seen that. It may not be personally, but you've seen it happen where that social media presence has some kind of dire or direct negative consequence to an actual relationship between people because of what's said or not said, or people's interpretation or misinterpretation of what was or wasn't said. That in a nutshell is not effective communication. Which brings us to topic number 4, which is what we call restoring relationships. What this topic really is trying to deal with or talk about is the fact that sometimes there's going to be points in your lives where relationships are going to need to be repaired or abandoned. And that's something that is not, it's not something you can enter into lightly. It's about recognizing that there's a difference between a healthy and an unhealthy relationship, and that those can have effects on the individual. When you look through the notes, you're going to see that we talk about the difference between mental health and mental illness. And why is it important to talk about that? Because, you know, the opening part of this, when we talk about restoring relationships, it's, you know, it talks about the difference between conflict and bullying. So it says, when bullied by someone, the person who is the bullied does not feel able to self-defend and instead feels afraid for their safety. It's really that perception of their ability to protect yourself. So if you don't feel you can protect yourself, there's an example of bullying. Now, I'm not making light of bullying. It happens. And yet, just as an interesting aside, we live in the 21st century where there's been a tremendous amount of awareness made of what bullying is, cyberbullying is, and yet it continues. It's grown since we've started this. It hasn't lessened. So I don't know if people aren't taking these lessons to heart, or people are recognizing that it's, you know, it's something that they can get away with because it can be anonymous. I really don't know. I just, it's kind of an interesting part of relationships where we, in the world we live in, how we've spent so much time making people aware of what bullying is and the effects it can have on people, and yet it continues in a number of different ways. Really, part of that restoring relationships is it comes from what Jesus said in Matthew 25 verse 40. Truly I tell you, just as you did to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. That's something we need to keep in mind when we're talking about restoring relationships, or making relationships work, or trying to repair relationships. All right. The other thing to keep in mind is, how does mental health and or mental illness affect relationships with others? And interestingly enough, in this time of, we're coming out of, you know, numerous lockdowns and dealing with what COVID has done to the world, you hear a lot of people talking about supporting our own mental health, etc. And it's important to try to maintain your own mental health. 5 things that you enjoy, or things that help you recharge, etc. But that all has to start with the individual. And I'm not saying that you can't, you shouldn't reach out for help when you think you need it, or go and confide and look for guidance and support and help from others. Not at all. But that has to come from the individual too. The individual has to recognize that, want that help, or look for that help. And it's not something that can be forced on an individual. All right. Um, Sorry, I'm just making sure I'm covering everything I need to as I'm skimming through my notes. So please excuse kind of the odd little gaps here and there. And I think that's it for topic 4. So now we're going to move on to topic 5, which is sense of self. One of the questions is, what is your real image versus the one we project on social media? Um, I think you have to understand that the sense of self is the way we see ourselves. It's the way we think and feel about ourselves and our ability to achieve our goals. The more we see ourselves the way we would like to, our ideal, the higher our self-esteem becomes. Um, Let me first tell you that each and every one of you, each and every person you meet, is worth a tremendous amount to the world. Losing an individual person diminishes the world. When people feel that they can't do something, they can't say something, they can't be who they think they should be, that diminishes the world. We take something away from the world when we take something away from people. When we deny their sense of self, or we do things that negatively affect someone's sense of self. That's that extends far beyond social media too. However, you guys live in a world where, I shouldn't say you guys, we all live in a world where social media plays a role. How much of a role it plays is up to you. Um, when you think about how your sense of self is shaped, it's shaped by the people around you, your friends, social media, parents, teachers, neighbors, neighborhoods. Uh, if you're part of a church, your church community can help shape you too. Um, you have to be cognizant of the fact that that social media is a community that can affect the way you perceive and deal with things, and that can distort and affect your sense of self. I mean, going back to my earlier, you talk about, I see it all the time. Celebrities, they've taken a break from social media for a month or whatever. They've gone on these retreats where it's to quiet the noise. And I'm like thinking, you embrace this social media because it's a way to continue to promote your popularity and make sure you're relevant to your fans. But then all of a sudden you need to take a break from it because you find it's toxic or has a negative effect on you. Um, I think there's a good example of how social media can shape you. Um, and that shaping is not up to you. You don't get to control that because you can see people who will take umbrage with things that you say or do. And people are going to do that. They're not going to be, not everybody's going to be your biggest fan. Learning to deal with that is going to give you a better idea of your sense of self just as much as having people who constantly um, reinforce the positive things for you. Okay. Uh, it's also, I think people fall into this trap of, if it's not generating a fair bit of buzz or people aren't liking it, it's not worthwhile, or it's not this, that, or the other thing. I think if it's something that you deem worthwhile to do or expend energy on or be part of, it's just as worthwhile as whatever somebody else deems worthwhile to expend energy or effort on. It's not up to others to tell you what you're doing is worth less or worth more. Um, it's got to come from within. And that, I know that's hard to, that's easier for me to say at probably 50 than it is for somebody your age to hear and kind of go, okay, yeah, it's doable. It's a lifelong project, and there are going to be times where people are going to say things to you, and you're going to be, that kind of hurt. I don't really like that, or it may call attention to flaws that you feel very self-conscious of. Um, you're compelled to try to deal with that in some way, and deal with it in a positive way. And if it consists of, or I should say, it continues and consists of negativity all the time, it goes back to those, maybe moving away from those relationships, or maybe limiting your social media presence if that's having a real negative effect on your sense of self or who you are and your mental health, or it's going to contribute to possible mental health issues or mental illness. Okay. Um, it's interesting to see that we've now got more and more statistics about how being constantly attached to the wired, I should say, not wild, wired world, it has a detrimental effect on our brain from a neurological standpoint. Um, we don't get that quiet we need to do other things with our brain. Um, this neuroscientist, one neuroscientist, and they don't name him in the notes, but it says being connected all the time, it doesn't allow the part of the brain that helps us feel empathy for others to develop. Uh, so in other words, we're less likely to be empathetic with other people when we're constantly wired, and that leads to a very negative way to deal with relationships online or deal with things that go on, because you're not empathetic. Now realize there's a difference between being empathetic and sympathetic. Empathetic means you understand where they're coming from. Um, Sympathy is what tends to drive people to do something about that, or try to do or act in a way that conveys an emotion. Empathy is understanding. Okay, we tend to lose that when we're connected. Um, you look at the what Scripture says about us even from a physical standpoint. It talks about us and our bodies and ourselves. We're people talk about the body being a temple, and if it's made in the image and likeness of God, there inherently that comes with some kind of respect for it, however it looks. Uh, I've always joked I have a face for radio, hence why I do these things for you guys instead of a lot of videos, only because I don't like the way I tend to look, even videos that I record where I'm not paying attention to myself per se. It's me talking about material. Um, I'm always very critical of my physical appearance. Um, just part of it goes back to when I grew up as a kid. I was I was a little chubby. I wouldn't say I was obese, but I was a bigger kid. Well, that brought along certain things that comments from certain people, etc. And it's I'm always constantly aware of that to one degree or another, and um, it's something that still sticks with me to this day. I mean, I'm not saying that it's completely overtaken my life in a negative way, but it's something that still clicks in the back of my head when people make comments about my physical appearance. If it's, I always kind of default to it's something quasi negative when it may not be. And that's, again, those are the kind of things that when we look at um, the flip side to that, really, when we're talking about this topic, you have to be happy and proud with who you are as a person, physically and emotionally. And yes, everybody's got their um, faults. Everybody's got things that could or could not be, could be worked on, whatever, you name it. Nobody is perfect. And really, it's about recognizing that you realize that it's your uniqueness that makes you important to the world. It's your unique physicality, your unique soul, your unique God-given personhood that is the most positive thing we can bring to relationships, bring to family, bring to the world. And that gets very distorted in throughout social media, TV, etc. And those distortions become lived realities for people. They tend to take on a life of their own, and it's a struggle. It's always going to be a struggle. Which kind of brings us to our next topic in Unit 4, which can be a little bit of a touchy one. So I'm going to try to tread lightly here, hopefully, and understand this talk is really more about trying to make you aware of the fact that it is a topic that um, religion doesn't stray away from. But it's topic 6 is about sexuality. I'm not talking about sex as reproduction. Um, we're not talking about sex, the act. We're talking about sexuality in the sense that that is part of the whole person that you are, and that um, we all have to realize there's a dignity to our sexuality, and that dignity comes from God. It's a gift from God. Our sexuality is a gift from God. And how we express that sexuality is also going to play a role in our relationships with one another in the communities that we're part of. Okay. Um, Really, in the notes, you're going to see things like, which is going to sound really weird to introduce the topic and then talk about natural law. Natural law affirms that we have the capacity to figure out what is good. We can trust our genuine search for the truth. Um, that's relatable to what chastity is. Um, Sexuality leads to sex. It's part of that sexuality that eventually people may engage in sex. And sexual intercourse was designed by God to help bring about intimate, selfless love, some unity, and for procreation. So it's in that sense, it's respected by the church. The church also recognizes that there may be elements of sex that fall outside of these kind of guidelines, fall outside of that, and therefore is not respected by the church. And the church believes, the church community feels that those have a detrimental effect on a person's sense of self. In other words, that sexuality can distort one's sense of self because one's engaged in actions that may not fall within the defined purpose of sex from the church's perspective. We have to recognize that um, we are going to be attracted, and this leads to we're going to be attracted to people. You're going to be attracted to other individuals, and that is part and parcel of our sexuality. That attraction that drives us, um, and again, that physical attraction is also rooted in a sense of self, in realizing what you're truly attracted to. Um, because your sense of self is tied into your sexuality. It's not your just an outright physical appearance. It's that sense of self that's tied to that as well. And therefore, we we need to look at this idea of chastity. Chastity is not just simply um, refraining from sex in a way that falls outside of what the church deems appropriate. Chastity is really uh, self-control, self-mastery. And for a lot of human beings, that the biggest struggle for self-mastery is in the realm of dealing with your sex and sexuality. Okay. And going back to what we talked about with social media, it can distort one's view of one's sexuality. Um, there are also elements of social media that do a great deal of trying to help reinforce a positive view of one's sexuality, but there's also equally, if not greatly so, more numbers of sites and situations that distort one's sense of self and sexuality in a very negative way. Okay. Um, Out of that idea of sexuality comes this idea of intimacy. There's a number of different types of intimacy that you're going to come across through. You go through the notes. You know, there's an intimacy of it's friendship. There's an intimacy in friendship. There's an intimacy at work, which sounds ridiculous to say it, but the fact is there are people that you may only see at work, and you share certain things at work, and that's a type of intimacy. A lot of people think intimacy is something that is solely and only connected to um, one's sexuality and romantic relationships. That is a type of intimacy, but one needs to recognize that intimacy exists on a whole host of levels in various relationships, not just within romantic attraction. Okay, and you have to understand that there's there's a lot of competing in various beliefs and advice around your sex and your sexuality. That's not it's not an easy thing to navigate, um, and it's again it's the best way I can say to you that you're going to deal with it is to really try to reinforce that positive sense of self, and that's going to be the best tool you're going to have in trying to figure out where and how that sexuality fits in with that sense of self, what that's going to look like for you, how that is going to, you know, affect the way you deal with romantic relationships in your life, and what that expression of self through your sexuality is going to look like. Okay, um, it's really, and I'll go back to this, the key to intimacy is the closeness and acceptance and trust that exists between two people in a relationship. And it may not have any kind of involvement with sex whatsoever. Um, Intimacy grows as people develop. So, you know, you're in relationships, then intimacy is going to grow over time as people grow and develop themselves. Um, and really, it goes back to like anything, even with the earlier parts of this unit. Um, the better you understand yourself, the better it's going to be for you to deal with any kind of intimacy in any kind of relationship. The better you know what you expect of yourself, want of yourself, need of yourself, through all the facets of specifically a romantic relationship, the better you're going to be able to deal with any type of relationships, including the romantic ones in your life, because you're going to know who you are. Um, the next part of this is, you know, people talk about love and sexuality. Um, so sexuality, maleness and femaleness, is not something that we have, but something that we are. It's one of God's gifts of creation. It involves the whole person, body, and spirit. Um, that isn't solely rooted in love. Loving someone, being in love with someone, is not rooted in the sexuality of the individual. That's a piece of it, but it is not the be all and end all. Um, it's it's also interesting when we talk about love, because then we move into this idea of love in marriage. Um, if you don't fully understand yourself, you don't love yourself, you're going to have a hard time loving someone else. And that's loving yourself is going to take work. And the work that you put into loving yourself is going to bear fruit in how you, specifically in a marriage, love your spouse, your significant other. Okay. Uh, I know this is it can be a touchy subject, and I'm trying to you know walk on eggshells a little bit here, so I don't leave you with the wrong ideas. As you go through the topic notes, you're going to see there's some more detail there. By all means, go through that. Go through that with your parents. Um, if you have any questions about anything thus far that we've talked about, or you're not sure about something, don't hesitate to reach out and we can talk more. Um, but again, it all comes back to that self mastery, that chastity, that virtue of chastity. Uh, the notes go: a chaste person is consistently in charge of his or her own sexual feelings rather than the feelings being in charge of the person. Um, the notes go on to say chastity is a habit of sexual self-control. I think it's about self-control in general, and sex is part of that because it's part of who we are as a created person in the image and likeness of God. That sexuality is something that we have to learn to control, but we also have to learn to control other elements that may affect our sexuality, um, and that's chastity. Um, Sexual intimacy creates a bond. In other words, when we choose to express that sexuality within a relationship, it creates a bond that's it's very hard to break. It can be much more difficult um, to deal with if a relationship ends, which is why the church and the faith looks at it as being something that should be reserved for married couples because they've made a commitment to a relationship for long term, if you will, or for you know until your spouse or you dies. Um, so that's something to keep in mind when we look at this idea of sexuality. It's a key component of who we are. It's also something that's respected and revered within the faith. Within it's an element that God created for us to allow us to procreate and create some kind of selfless bond of love, some unity, other form of unity within a married relationship. But it's a tightrope to walk, and it's given how the world, social media, other elements view sexuality and sex. There's that constant battle. Hence why you see the term chastity very much come up in this unit, not others, in the sense that it is about self mastery and self control. Which kind of brings us to topic number 7, which is just simply labeled challenges. Um, and again, it's how the role and expression of sexuality can be distorted. I've touched on that a little bit. Um, so you're going to see things in the notes talking about sexualization. Um, when a person is evaluated for their physical characteristics and sexiness and objectified um, as quote unquote decorative. Then you get into things like pornography. Okay, um, realize that because we're all made in the image and likeness of God, um, it's not, we can't reduce someone to a what instead of a who. And what I mean by that is we can't use, um, well, look, what's one of the best selling magazines on the planet? It's the Sports Illustrated Swimsuit edition. There's an example of sexualizing women under the guise of sports, or whatever you want to say. In fact, it's so popular that even when ESPN had their magazine, they had the body issue where they chose to highlight, athletes that were, they were sexualized. Uh, that's those are examples of things that are kind of counter to what um, we as Catholics believe we're created for. What our physicality, our sexuality is created for. It's not to dehumanize us or objectify us. Uh, you know, that's where we get into trouble. We, you not only sexualization, but you look at this, the ideas of pornography and the fact that pornography exists, um, uh, and crosses a lot of boundaries and lines that just kind of boggle the mind. Uh, you just recognize that those elements of society are there to exploit the individual, exploit one aspect of the individual. That's that individual sexuality, and that exploitation it's never right. Any kind of exploitation, but this one tends to take on a very devious, um, because it challenges your chastity, it challenges your self-control, it challenges a lot of things, that are set forth in in church doctrine and our faith, and it can have a very negative effect on sense of self. It can destroy sense of self, um, if people get involved in these things, or get caught up in them, and that's you know it goes back to the fact that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. That can't happen, um, when you're talking about sexualization and pornography. Um, Anytime media sexualizes anyone, it affects all of us. It affects the dignity of all of us, and I don't think people recognize that. Um, it also affects our relationships with others and with God, or it's just it's detrimental to relationships across the board when we sexualize individuals. Okay, it's not a healthy starting point or healthy way to base relationships on. Okay, or deal with it. And that is the last topic for Unit 4. Again, thanks very much for listening. If you have any questions or concerns, by all means, either email me or we'll set up a time for an individual Zoom meetings to clarify anything. And until the next time, have a great day.